Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for all the applause I assume I'm hearing virtually, since I don't hear it live. And I'm very honored and happy to be here to be sharing with you about something about acceptance and commitment therapy. And hopefully you'll find this an interesting introduction that you may be able to incorporate into part of your clinical work. So the learning objectives over this next hour or so, I hope to be able to cover something about what are the distinguishing features in the third wave psychotherapies, of which includes ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, and describe some of the core processes of ACT, and there are 6 of them, and then helping you to consider how to formulate patient struggles from an ACT perspective. So first, the theory and philosophy of which ACT comes from, and it's also the theory and philosophy of the third wave. Now, the term third wave psychotherapy is a terminology that has kind of come about in part from the development of ACT among other therapies. And certainly there are like hundreds and zillions of psychotherapies out there, of which I'm happy to see that today we're covering 3 of them, including earlier in the session CBT, DBT, and now ACT. And because there's so many ways to do psychotherapy, there are different ways to also classify psychotherapy. So this is kind of one version of it. So one way of looking at psychotherapy is to kind of consider like the classical psychodynamic psychotherapy as kind of like the original form of doing therapy. And then there are waves of revolutions after that that tries to challenge previous assumptions and try to advance the field in some way. So from kind of this perspective of the evolution of psychological interventions, and this kind of way of looking at things is more behavioralist perspective, but one way of looking at it is that from challenging the first wave or the original way of doing psychotherapy, there comes kind of the first wave psychotherapy, so-called, which is kind of the behavioral therapy, in which case there's almost like a reaction to the fact that psychodynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis is based so much on things you can't see, things that are hypothesized, that there is an emphasis on let's focus on things we can see, and so we can be more scientific, more empirical about it in some way. So some of the aspirations of behavioral therapy is coming in to focus on behavior, things we can see, at least in the initially. And some of the derivatives of the classical behavioral therapy is still with us today, and is still one of the most powerful interventions, including exposure as a way of challenging phobias and anxiety disorders. It still remains very powerful. Behavioral therapies has also taught us a lot about how we learn things and behavioral paradigms, etc. And then comes kind of a second wave, if you will, of revolution, in which people say we are just a little bit more sophisticated than dogs and pigeons. So even if you give us rewards, we may not listen to you, and we choose not to. So people become interested in why that is, and there comes a second wave of psychotherapy, which is to focus on cognition, about how we think. So in some ways, we can think about second wave as cognitive therapy, where there's an emphasis on cognition, where we are looked at as more information processors. We're like the computer age now. We want to look at the way people think. What makes us tick is how we think, and how we think dictates how we behave. And then there is some kind of, I guess, a struggle, looking at how do we reconcile between behavioral therapies and cognitive therapies. And so they challenge each other. But oftentimes in these days, we just kind of throw it all in, kind of just have it all in, and have a manual that says we do everything, and we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's been a lot of success in some ways to throw it all in and do manualized cognitive behavioral therapy, because you can manualize it, people can test it, and people like evidence-based. So everyone is kind of doing CBT. Sometimes people don't even do CBT, but they will say they're doing CBT because there's so much force behind it, so much empirical evidence that it works, that everyone likes it so much. And we're kind of doing some cognition and some behavioral work. Now, even though we are kind of already sort of doing everything, but that's still not enough. And I think that it's out of probably the necessity of still meeting with challenges that new waves got created. So then comes a whole bunch of psychotherapies that may not classically fit into the schema of things. And this ushers in the so-called third wave psychotherapies. And so you can see on the screen that's kind of washing everything away, but not really. But at least there's a talk of perhaps a third wave coming in. And these psychotherapies, and I've listed some of them here, includes acceptance and commitment therapy, which we call ACT, and there's DBT, and there's mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and there are several others. So these therapies did not come together as like kind of a conspiracy theory to overthrow anything. At least I don't think it happened that way. It came out of different originators that are working with different kinds of patient population. So DBT you've heard about, it comes of course out of Marshall Linehan's work, and I won't go too much into that, but obviously it was developed originally for people with recurrent self-injurious behavior or borderline personality disorder. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has been developed for people with recurrent depression, people who get depressed over and over again, and trying for us to find ways of preventing the next relapse. And then there's acceptance and commitment therapy, which is kind of a kind of psychotherapy that deals with many different kinds of patient populations, as we'll see. So these psychotherapies are originating from different originators, but they did all came together for a kind of conference. They did notice that there are some commonalities that underlies them. So since you've heard the DBT talk, you can kind of compare as you're hearing ACT, what are some of the commonalities? But certainly, one of the commonalities among them is the emphasis more on using mindfulness and acceptance as concepts. So much so that actually after that particular conference, there's a book that came out of it called, I think it's called Acceptance and Mindfulness, or Mindfulness Acceptance, that each chapter was authored by like Stephen Hayes for acceptance commitment therapy. Marshall Linehan has talked about DBT, that looks at why they are so special in the way that they utilize these principles. And that's how the term third wave comes about. So we can think about how these paradigms challenges our thinking. And so at the end of today's talk, even if you feel like you haven't mastered ACT, maybe you can think about how this, maybe even along with DBT, could be somewhat different from a traditional CBT, and how it offers up new ways of looking at problem solving, looking at patient care, and perhaps looking at life in general. So to kind of contrast these paradigms, I like to use these two kind of metaphors. So this is something that you will see on your screen. So I understand that in the screen you'll see me, and then besides me, you'll see a figure. So if you are able to see a figure, and I understand that you can type in, maybe you can type in what you see, and maybe we can see if we see what you see or you see what we see. So let's see. If you can type in what you see, and we'll see if the moderators can let us know what you see.
Oh, here it comes. So what we have is the responses are a lady circling around, a woman spinning in both directions, a dancing girl spinning, dancer, dancing girl, a woman spinning to the right. It is a black-figured oh, this is a detailed person. It's a black-figured woman who is twirling around on her left leg, a woman twirling on one foot, female, human, moving silhouette.
Okay, so thank you for that response. Wonderful. So I guess we can use this as a paradigm of how it can potentially serve as projective testing, like the first way the kind of psychoanalytic way would be what do you project onto it. But of course, some of you have mentioned that it's spinning a certain kind of direction. Now, I would just like to hear which directions do you feel that she's spinning. If you feel she's spinning towards the left, can you just put in left? If you feel she's spinning to the right, can you just put in R for right? And maybe we'll get a quick tally of whether she's spinning to the left or right. And you can't see this, but we have a little bit of live audience, and they're just whispering, trying to figure this out too. So don't feel so bad if you don't know what's going on.
Mostly to the right, and a few people saying to the left.
So we've got mostly to the right and several people to the left.
And a couple people saying both.
And some people are seeing it spinning both ways. So that's very interesting, right? Or left. So what then this is illustrating is that I'm showing you the same image. And at the same time, you on your computer screen, some of you are seeing it spinning to the left, and some of you are seeing it spinning to the right. And if there are several of you in the room, you may not even necessarily agree. And as that's happening the case here in this room, there's a big fight going on about who's right. And at the same time, I think some of you might even be able to see it changing. That is, sometimes it's spinning to the left, and sometimes it's spinning to the right. And we have indication that inside this room, people are going crazy about how rapidly it's changing from left to right. So let me assure you that this is no technological trick in a way, because we're just doing a continuous loop. And in terms of its spinning to left or the right or switching, you are doing all of that with your brain. Congratulations, you are awake. So what we see here then is kind of a quick metaphor about how CBT works, cognitive behavioral therapy. The 1 hour you sat through this morning, I just captured it in 30 seconds. So because this is what CBT in a way is, which is when we all see one thing, we tend to all interpret it differently. And also, once you interpret in one way, it's kind of hard to see it the other way because your brain tries to convince itself that whatever you first thought is true. I don't know if this is what you got from the CBT lecture, but now you have a sense of what it's like for you experientially to be able to look at one stimulus, one thing, and to notice that, first of all, you might see things differently from another person, and also how difficult it might be, even though if your friend beside you or I'm here saying to you that there's an opposite way of looking at it, it may even be somewhat challenging for you to flip around. And that's the challenge of CBT sometimes, because we say to patients that there is another way of looking at things that's more rational. They may hear you, but they may have a difficult time endorsing it, right? But this is the power of our brain. And so I think this is a good paradigm of what CBT is trying to do. It is trying to get you to see things sometimes in even opposite ways, to consider that there is a possibility of seeing something different. Now, keep this in mind while we now move on to another paradigm of doing things, which is probably more in line with ACT or mindfulness. And since mindfulness has to do with awareness and attention, that this is called an awareness test. And I've excerpted this from someplace, and some of you might have seen it. If you've seen it, don't ruin it for everyone else by shouting out the answer. You can type out the answer, you won't ruin anybody, I think. So if you know the answer, you can certainly text it to me. But we'll just kind of do it together, and we'll see what we see again.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team...
So this is the interactive time again. So if you can go to your keyboard and just write your answer in, type your answer in, so that we'll have a quick poll of the audience out there, and I'll be happy to let you know how many of you got it right or wrong.
So, okay, again, we are being flooded. So we have answers like 13, 6, gorilla, ape in the middle, a dancing bear, and then 16, and then it keeps going.
It keeps going into where?
And there's 92 even.
92.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I couldn't keep up.
Okay. So the ranges went from, what's the lowest number?
8
8.
with a question mark.
So it went from 8 to 92. That's the highest. Do we have a higher bidder than that? Come on. So we got anywhere between 8 and 92. So that's a wide range. I think it says something about our ability to count, first of all. It does say something like that. Maybe we go into the field we go into because we're not good at math. Maybe we want to make that point. But I think certainly there's another point to be made here. And some of you had talked about the dancing gorilla. So how many of you have not seen the dancing gorilla? You can type in just a question mark and we'll know that you're confused. So just type in question mark and we'll know if there are anybody who did not see the gorilla. Dancing gorilla. So you should be able to see a dancing gorilla doing the break dance moonwalk. If you missed that, can you type in a question mark so we'll know someone out there is confused? If not, we can move on because we're now all clear.
Lots.
So apparently there is a whole lot of you that's confused, which is great because that's how we learn. So this video then shows something that's very interesting, and that is it actually shows a dancing gorilla doing the moonwalk across the screen. So in fairness to all of you who did not see it, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide so you know it's a previous slide, and then come back to this slide so you know it's the same slide. So you know you first saw the dancing lady, and then I'm going to go to the next slide.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
So at this point, you should be seeing the dancing bear, and here's the moonwalk. Okay, so I'm pretty sure everyone has seen it this time, right? So if you still don't see it, you can type in question mark, but otherwise I assume everyone has seen it. Now, there's no more question mark, right? Okay. If you like this video, you can type in an exclamation mark. This is how we work emoticons in an abbreviated fashion. So I think what this show is a different kind of paradigm then. Because you are told that this is an awareness test, so you were fairly warned. And we are looking at our awareness. It's not so much to try to change your mind, because you can see that we are playing the same clip twice. But that is just simply being aware to what is actually right in front of you. And you will notice that a lot of us did not see what was actually right in front of us. So I think the question is, how come? So this is what we're trying to cultivate in mindfulness, and then to some degree, I think that this can be a metaphor for ACT as well, which is kind of learning to see actually what is kind of already there, but we are kind of interfered with, and so we kind of miss what is important. Now, why do you think you miss, or some of you have missed something obvious? I think some of you might be thinking that we are not being fair to you because we ask you, different kinds of questions, let's say counting basketballs. And then I would probably ask you this, which is, why do you listen to me at all? Why do you listen to the video? It's just a voice saying you should count, right? So this is relevant in general. Why do we do the things we do when we're told to do them, or we even think that we ought to do them? And in doing so, when we listen to certain sets of specific instructions, whether it comes from your mom, it comes from a voice in a commercial, it comes from me, why listen to us at all? And in listening to us, could we be missing something? I guess is also the other question, right? And obviously, speaking to people who are working with early psychosis, this takes on a heightened double meaning about listening to voices, of course, right? So this is where kind of ACT a little bit comes from. So a little bit about ACT then. And by the way, you'll notice I keep on saying ACT and not ACT. This is how we usually distinguish people who know ACT and people who don't know ACT. People who don't know ACT will always say ACT. People who know ACT will say ACT. So if you want to at least come across as knowing ACT, you will say ACT. Now the reason is, it's because ACT also is about action too. So by the end of the talk, you might understand why the inventors pretty much emphasize to call it ACT. And so when you go to a practitioner of ACT, they will always say we do ACT. And we always have a joke, inside joke, saying that if people continue to call us ACT, we're going to call people who do CBT doing spit, which is hard to pronounce, like you're doing spit. So, certain things work for a different therapy, so we call it ACT. So the first randomized controlled trial of ACT versus cognitive therapy, CT, has been actually done many years ago. The pioneers of ACT has certainly gone back to the drawing board instead of promoting the therapy to work backwards and look at some of the basic philosophies and assumptions and theory that underlies ACT, which is why I'm spending a little bit of time on this to give you the sense of the fundamental differences, because sometimes it's not so much the technique as it is understanding this paradigm difference, as I've just shown you. And this kind of ways of contrasting paradigms has even made it to mainstream media. So for example, this article which appeared in the Time magazine, and that's a good measure of when you become interesting because you're featured in Time, is provocatively called "Happiness Isn't Normal." And so this is kind of to contrast how perhaps our usual way of looking at things, how we try to achieve happiness, and ACT comes from a tradition where maybe that this assumption may not hold true. So we look at the fundamental medical model, of which, of course, I'm a physician. I come from this tradition. We often have like assumption of healthy normality or disease model. That is, if you're healthy, you're normal, and those are the same thing. And so I have an image of myself just like what I show you in the screen. This is what I actually look like every night when I look at the mirror. And if you don't see me like this, it's probably because of some technical glitch. So this is one way of looking at the world, that we all aspire to be certain kinds of ideal as being normal. And that comes from a tradition where maybe we're starting to question that, is what if this is more closer to normal, that life is suffering, and that suffering can be part of the normality, that we're more like Atlas than the other guy. And the other thing also philosophically is that from a Western tradition, there's such thing as mechanism, which is to say that all things can be broken down to be explained by physical causes. And when extended to how do we understand human beings, we do the same. That is, if we can break it down into parts and analyze it, we can find out what is broken down and fix it, like a car. And if we can find out that which of your thoughts are distorted, we should identify it, pinpoint it, and fix it. Almost like a car. If you have a dysfunctional thought, you can identify it, and you can replace it with a functional, good thought, balanced thought. Now, by the way, I don't want to come across as in CBT doesn't work, because actually I do teach CBT, supervise CBT, and use CBT. But for the sake of contrast, we want to look at where they differ in terms of philosophical stance and how we treat problems. Because this way of looking at things certainly does work, but we're looking at, is there another way to look at the human being? Is there another way to look at problems? Now, extending that analogy to actual psychological suffering, then we usually see problems and sufferings that your clients come to you with, and we try to analyze it. And how do we do that? We try to figure out causes. What caused the person to be this way? And they may themselves engage in this cause searching. What caused me to behave this way, to think this way, feel this way? And those causes we arrive at through our rational brain, our reasoning. And there are good reasons why we are suffering. It must be this or that. And oftentimes these reasons are, and our conclusion often comes to be, that there's something wrong with the way we're thinking. There's something wrong with the way you're feeling. There's something wrong with the way that you're able to control those feelings, that we got to control our thoughts better, control our feelings better. So this is oftentimes the conclusion. We got to fix that thought, fix that feeling, because that's broken down. Now, this hopefully does make sense, because it's based on logic, so this model should make sense. And secondly, it probably is familiar to you because this is how we generally problem solve. And oftentimes, it even works very well. Again, we are looking at cases when this doesn't work so well. Is there an alternative to this way of looking at problems and suffering? And so this is what we're here to explore. So from all this preamble, and from a philosophical point of philosophical way of looking at things, the inventors of ACT came to a philosophy which is called functional contextualism, which is, and you can see in the slides there are different philosophical arguments, but without getting too much into it, just even the name, its emphasis is that we can look at things more focusing on function over structure. That is, instead of looking at structurally what part of your thinking process had gone wrong, and identify which of the thought is wrong, we can look at functions, how they all work together. And instead of mechanistic looking at things, we can always look at things contextually. Everything happens in the context. What is the context in which things work well, and what's the context in which things don't work so well? So functional contextualism philosophically looks at function and context. And it's on top of this philosophy that there's a basic science that comes out of it, which is called the scientific theory called relation frame theory. And this theory, it's actually a theory about how we develop language. And when we say language, we're not just saying, am I speaking to you in English or Chinese or whatever, but really language as in our thought, our cognition, what you even say to yourself. So if you look at the slide, you see, actually, what do you see? Since this is interactive, maybe people can look at the picture with a blue background and white fluffy center and type in what do you see with the white fluffy centered blue background picture on the right lower corner. What do you see?
We, again, have that detailed person, white Parisian cat, cat, white fluffy cat, lots of people saying cat.
Okay, lots of people saying cat. Notice none of you said gorilla or breakdancing, so you certainly are still with me, awake at this point, which is wonderful. So notice when I asked you to label the white fluffy center, people generally put cat or Parisian cat, or right, and none of you have put down gorilla or cotton ball or fur ball or anything like that. So all of you are pretty precise in pointing out it's a cat. So which means that at some point in your history, you've learned to call it cat, right? So you'll notice that the top thing, the sound cat, I put in quotes C-A-T, it's the sound cat. Now, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, which is C-A-T, and what word does that spell? I think most of you would probably know it spells cat. So in fact, those two arrows that I show, it's kind of mimicking how you learn things. At some point in your life, someone point to a fluffy creature and say, oh, look, cat. And then somewhere along the line, someone probably pointed out to you or taught you in class that if we put the letter C-A-T together, you say cat, right? So those two associations, that's no surprises. So what we have been able to show through relation frame theory testing and experiment is that the human beings have an innate capacity to do all the dotted arrows all by themselves. That is, at no point did we need to chase after a cat and put a sticky label C-A-T for you to associate those two things, right? Can you imagine doing that to every animal, trying to label everything and to learn it? We're much more efficient than that. We're able to associate things and make associations even though you didn't have direct contact with one another. So this is fundamentally, in a nutshell, what relation frame theory is kind of about. It's about how we come to have what we call language, how we learn to call things, but more macroly, how we make sense out of things, how we make associations, how we even think through all these kinds of association, right? So all this is an equivalent class association, and you may say, hey, I'm a clinician. What do I care about this? Now, there are a number of implications just directly from this theory, even before we get to the clinical part. Well, first of all, it is this, that because these things are not directly in relationship with one another, that means we have the capacity to infer things that we have not had direct contact and experience with, which means a client can say to you that I'm better off dead. Now, when they're saying this to you, they're believing it at 100% certainty, even though they have never gone to hell, came back again, and say, wow, this is so much better, so much cooler. They haven't had that experience, right? But to them, because of this equivalence, right, that they're able to make inferred relationships, and it's so real that it's stuck on, because it's one equates to the other, that, oh, if I die, there's no more suffering. To them, it's kind of glued on to one another. So our properties is that when we learn associations, they can be so strong that even though there's no direct relationship between things, they can be so strong that it's really hard to convince someone otherwise. Like, it would be pretty hard for me to say to you that that's not a cat, I've been fooling you all around, it's actually a bear, right? You would kind of say that you don't know what you're talking about, because to us, that picture is synonymous now with the cat. That's just become the truth. So there's a subtlety here in that oftentimes our thoughts become so wedded to reality, it becomes like the truth. So that's kind of one thing, which is how glued we are to our thoughts, that it's as if we experience it as reality, that we don't just see thoughts as thoughts. You tell me it's just in my head, but no, to me, it's just fact, right? It's not any more ambiguous than to say that this is a cat. The other is that other than this equivalent class relationship, there are different classes of relationship we can associate with things. If it wasn't cat, if it wasn't cat in this triangle, but what if we put down 5, 4, and 3 in those 3 apices? Now, we know not to put 5 equals to 4 equals to 3. You will probably put 5 is greater than 4, greater than 3. In other words, there are other kinds of relationships we can learn early on, such as what is greater than, what's less than. And then clinically, again, we can think about this. What if we say that, she's smarter than her and she's smarter than me, right, in this relationship? Among these 3 people here, I don't know if you can see all 3 of us. There are 3 of us here. If we make that kind of inference, one is greater than another, one is greater than another, then I will understand that I'm less than the others. Again, we can make this kinds of comparisons and judgments, and to me, it could be very real. So your client can say to you that, I'm useless, through these kinds of comparisons and rules. So from this ways of associating things, not do we only take things as real, but we also make different kinds of judgments, evaluations, and relationships, and we are even wedded to them. And we can make evaluative statements that can then directly impact on how we organize and how we handle the world. So these are just some few applications of this, even directly translating into clinical terms. But there are more, because, and maybe for the sake of time, we'll skip this slide. Because we just don't deal with words, individual words, but we even deal with clumps of words, which are sentences. In other words, we form long sentences, which becomes rules and behaviors. So consider these 3 examples. I can't give in to my mom's demands. Imagine you have this in your head. I don't know if you've ever had this in your head, or whether you are in the receiving end of this, where you just feel like your son or daughter is just not listening to you just because. And then look at the second one. If I go out, I won't enjoy myself anyways. I need to go lie down. So think about someone who is not motivated, who might be depressed, who might be anxious. And then the third one, I have to wash my hands again. I can't stand the dirtiness. Think of someone who has OCD or has some fear, right? So these are internalized rules, and it may or may not be true, but they're listening to the rules. But that's a magic thing. Once we have a rule, we can actually use these rules to override what's in front of us, even if it's punishing or rewarding. So that's probably, if we just use the strict paradigm of behavioral therapy, if I'm just going to reward every patient and punish every bad behavior, everyone will have model behavior. And we all know that doesn't work. But what we've shown through various research is that when people have a rule, some rules are so powerful, it actually overrides whether you're getting rewarded or not. So you might be frustrated that why is my patient keep on doing the same thing, even though the consequence is negative. It seems like the person, I don't know, keep on using substances or keep on skipping school or keep on doing this and that, or keep on staying out late. They are quote unquote punished. But how come they're not, changing their behavior? It's because they have rules that override them internally, potentially. So think about the power of rules, and now think back of how many of you did not see the gorilla because you were following a rule. And I'm not faulting you for following that rule. You've been all very good audience to follow the rule and give us a number. But it is this rule following that we can get into that helps us miss things in life. And this is where ACT comes from, is how do we look at the rules that in and of themselves may even have its own rationale. It may even sound perfectly reasonable. You may not even be able to dispute it. You cannot dispute the soundness of a question of how many passes does the team of white make. But it is just the overall paradigm of following those kinds of rules that get you into trouble. So here we're beginning to see something that's slightly different. It's not so much that you need to learn to think differently, but it's how you relate to those thoughts. So this is all about the background, philosophy, and theory. So I think it's a good segment for me to just kind of break for a moment and see if there are any questions in the audience, whether I have lost everyone or everyone is enlightened. And so maybe you can type in some questions now, and then I'll launch into the next part.
One of the questions is in terms of clinicians' learning curve to learn CBT versus ACT. Can you talk a bit about what the differences might be?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because sometimes we often struggle with this. And which is probably why I spend so much time on this initial part. And if you go to another ACT workshop, someone else might do it very differently. Because CBT, there's a lot of clear content you need to learn. You need to know how to do, and I teach CBT, so I teach those steps. Like you need to know how to help people identify thoughts and feelings and challenge them, use a thought record. So there's a lot of series of steps. And in ACT, the philosophy and the spirit of it is very important. And I think having master or having an insight into this philosophy means you can learn ACT very quickly, or conversely, you may find that it's kind of hard to really understand. And also, I think there is some research that even shows this, which is it's easier to learn CBT in the sense that people get very confident because they see that from a checklist, I did learn all these things. And from ACT, you might feel like, I kind of learned these things, but I'm not sure what I'm doing or how to do them, because a lot of it also depends on how you position strategies. But certainly, I think that there is clear content that also needs to be learned. So I would say that for ACT, maybe even more important to CBT, you need to learn the didactic portion, but also have a way of experientially feeling the material, so that hopefully you're feeling me right now through the lenses and through these exercises as part of your learning experience.
Sorry, I have one more comment or perhaps question. A lot of what you are talking about makes me think of sort of elements of both interpersonal psychotherapy as well as psychodynamics, where it's really the emphasis is about relationship building and acceptance. Some of us, the good enough mother, right? Being able to be good enough and not anyways, I don't know if you had any comment about that, or if perhaps maybe ACT came from some of those theories or borrowed from it.
And as we'll see the next slide, to be honest, I haven't even talked about real ACT up to now, but that's totally a very astute observation. Amazing that even before I talked about act. But what is so true is act because it is the spirit of some fundamental way of a paradigm of looking at things. That clinically, when you do it, it can look very different from person to person. It can look almost like psychodynamic. It can look almost like CBT, but slightly changed. It can look like Gestalt. And in fact, a lot of the ACT techniques exercise are borrowed from all these different traditions, as long as they're consistent with this way of shifting and negotiating difficulties. Very good. So thank you for those excellent questions. And now we'll launch into actually talking about what ACT is, since I'm almost burning up my time. Now we're into ACT proper. Now, as I said before, the reason I spent so much time on the previous, which is on functional contextualism and then what we call RFT, is that ACT is built upon those philosophies. And without understanding them, then you'll be applying what you see on this slide, but it will actually be CBT, for example. So what we see here is the overall schema of how currently ACT is conceptualized. There are 6 core processes, and I will walk through them with you through what we call this kind of like hexaflex as a kind of metaphor. So you can see that in the center is psychological inflexibility. So ACT sees that people getting into trouble as being inflexible psychologically. So if we look at the top, very top, we have dominance of conceptualized past and future. And that's to say that a lot of the times we are kind of stuck in the past, something that's happened in the past but you're stuck on. It could be some childhood trauma, it could be something you did wrong that you regretted, but you carry that with you and it's kind of impacting on how you're interacting with the current situation. Or future, things hasn't happened yet, but you're afraid. You're afraid things might happen. You're afraid that your things may be stolen. It hasn't been stolen yet, but it could be, my voice has told me to, that it would happen. So things that hasn't happened, but we spend time thinking about it. Or, my spouse is going to succumb to a car accident. So things we're worried about. So ACT use various forms of exercises to increase patients' contact with the present moment. So this can be as elaborate as doing a traditional form of mindfulness exercise. Let's sit down and meditate for 5 minutes. And that can be part of an ACT protocol or ACT action that you do in a group or individual setting with a client. Or it can be as simple as, how are you doing right now at this moment? And if your client says, oh, not too bad, but I didn't sleep very well last night. That's probably why I'm so tired. And last night I was thinking about this and that. You always bring the person back. And how about right now? So even small techniques like that, and in discussion with the person, brings the person's awareness and attention to the here and now. So this is part of the ACT, which is kind of paying attention and helping us to realize that we're often drifting away from the moment of now. So, for example, I might have a kind of clipboard in front of me sometimes, and in a session, and then I might say to a patient, what color of tie am I wearing today? And the person will usually guess. And right now I'm asking you, what color of tie did I wear in the beginning of a broadcast? If you're not allowed to rewind this clip, which I think you cannot, right? Now, I'm not going to ask you because I bet most of you didn't pay attention. And it is about, again, the awareness, the gorilla in the room, right? So how often are we focusing on the now, and how often are we thinking about, when is this webinar over? What am I, where am I going tonight for dinner? That would be nice, that kind of thing. So the power of the present moment. If we go down the axis to the bottom, you see attachment to conceptualized self. Now, we carry around a lot of concepts of ourselves. Like I might think that I'm a presenter, I'm male, I'm a psychiatrist. So all these are ideas about myself, right? And it's helpful because knowing that I'm a male means I won't enter the wrong washroom, right? So it's very important. And it's very helpful. I use it all the time, every time I go pee. So these concepts of ourselves are fundamentally important. Of course, we have other concepts of ourselves, like I'm smart or I'm not. I'm successful or I'm a failure. I'm good at this, but I'm not so good at this. You know, I may be okay at this, but I'm never a dancer. And I would never consider karaoke singing, ever. Ever. Just ever. Shoot me. Ever. Right? So there are people like that because we are so wedded to concepts of ourselves. Or I'm a psychiatrist, right? Or I'm whatever. Now, even though these concepts are powerful and they are helpful, but of course, being wedded to them means you're locked. What if one day I get fired? What if you kick me off and you say I'm a terrible speaker? Like, am I devastated? So that's the question. And also, as you heard, it also limits us from doing things. People may stop going to karaoke just because they think they can't sing, right? You don't have to prove it to be. So we look at concepts of ourselves as helpful, but in certain circumstances, in certain contexts, not. So ACT uses various techniques to actually help us see ourselves as context, self as context. And there are many different terms to help us understand this. It's also called transcendent sense of self or an observer kind of self, which is to see that all these roles, labels, judgments about ourselves are just psychological content about ourselves, but they are actually not ourselves. Even when we say, I think, therefore I am actually not a thought. I'm not a piece of thought. I'm not someone's brainwave. I am a human being, a spirit, an essence. And I can have different kinds of thoughts. I'm actually not even defined by my thoughts, feelings, roles, and title. If you pull me off the stage and don't let me speak, I'm still here, right? If you don't let me practice, I'm still a person, right? So it is helping a person to maintain a sense of self, even though, and in fact, be less wedded to what they are thinking about themselves that can be a destructive force. It becomes a stable platform. It also helps us move on and not get stuck in certain ideas about ourselves. So it is to kind of look at ourselves as like a vessel, a container, as in just like a plate. You know, today my plate includes, I just had chicken, so it includes chicken. And maybe tomorrow I'll have sushi, and maybe I was wishing for sushi today, but I didn't get sushi. It looked like sushi on the box today, but it was actually chicken. But instead of being wedded to what am I having on my plate, I am actually seeing myself as the container. And that container can be so flexible because every day can have something different. And if today I feel terrible about myself because I just suck and screw up something, and tomorrow there's a new day, I'm ready to receive what else is new. So it helps build a person's sense of self. So, and then if we go in the upper left-hand corner, it's experiential avoidance. And experiential avoidance is one of the core difficulties that ACT conceptualize people as engaging as having. And that is, we often try to run away from things we don't like and things we're afraid of and things that cause us to feel negative. And who can blame us? That's rational, that makes sense. We should run away from those things. And a lot of this instinct is correct because it's been evolved as a protective mechanism. Except that in cases where it hurts us. And in those cases, ACT introduces willingness and acceptance. So here, you finally come across the word acceptance, which is even the title of the therapy called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Now, when people hear the word acceptance, they tend to think that means I'm just going to go lie down and just take what's given to me, or it just means I'm giving up, or it just means I love to be punished. Actually, it means none of those things. Here, ACT sees it as willing to experience what is there, as opposed to running away from what is there. So you can see the acceptance here is put in as an opposite of experiential avoidance. That is, when someone keeps on trying to avoid, you look at acceptance as a possible answer. So sometimes when people are trying to suppress certain things, whether it's a thought, maybe it's a thought that I'm not good enough, and they say, I need better self-esteem, so I better not have that thought. I would try not to think about that thought. Or it could be a voice, it could be something they're scared of. And the paradox is often the more you try not to think about it, the more it becomes almost a defining feature of your life, that this is something you're trying to avoid all your life. Whereas ACT is saying, what if you're willing to have that as a thought? Which is now, I'm starting to also go into lower left-hand corner, which is cognitive fusion. A lot of times, in fact, that we're avoiding things is because of this cognitive fusion, which is to say that when I point to you a fluffy ball, you'll say cat. That kind of immediate fusion. We're wedded to how we see the world. We're wedded to rules. We're wedded to how we think. So, whereas in CBT, we talk about challenging thoughts, and we call it cognitive restructuring, which is trying to change the way you think. ACT is saying, what if we use acceptance, say it's okay to think exactly the way you think right now because you've tried to change it, you haven't had success. And so experience brings you to this point. What if you're able to open yourself to accept that you have that as a thought, not as more than what it is, but it's a thought. So the cognitive diffusion is to tease apart the apparency of reality versus a thought, to be able to see our thoughts as really thoughts. And if we're able to do that, the upper right-hand corner is that oftentimes we go even guided often by our automatic unworkable rules, how we ought to behave. Again, how we count balls when we were told. Instead, we may be guided by our values. So ACT is also a values-based therapy, which is to help clients to really reflect on what is fundamentally important to them in their lives. Like if the world was going to end in 5 minutes, what are you going to do? Are you going to continue watching this live broadcast because it's so damn great? Or are you going to do something else, right? So that sometimes makes us question what truly is the most important things about us in our lives if we stop from following automatic rules or thoughts or stories or so busy running away from things. We can be guided by our values, which can be served as a compass. And once we have that, which is the lower right-hand corner, we can plan committed action, which is remain committed to our values. And through our action, we actually will do things. If our values, it's about, developing relationships with people, then a committed action can be, I am going to go out, even though my voices can be saying that it's dangerous outside, for example. So it is enhancing our ability to commit to our values, what is important to us, in the face of things that are scary that we can accept. And if we're able to do all of this, so notice that all of those influence one another. We say there are 6, and in fact, there are double arrows of all these things. They all influence one another, and if we're able to do all of that, or even one of that often moves the other, we're enhancing our psychological flexibility, which is the core model then of ACT. So if, in a nutshell, CBT is about helping us to have more rational thoughts, this is more about now being stuck with our thoughts that we have, both rational and irrational. How can we be psychologically flexible so that we're able to commit to our values, to do the things that we want to do because it's in the service of our values, and we can stop running away from things. So this is the core model of ACT. So a shorthand of looking at it is be here now as a pure awareness, and open up yourself so that you can watch your thinking, knowing what matters to you, and then doing what it takes. Russ Harris has a book called The Happiness Trap. If you think about it, it's almost the antithesis of like the happiness handbook in CBT. 2 ways of looking at negotiating happiness, right? And this is the model of ACT. Now, just knowing a little bit about ACT, just like a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous things. Sometimes we can be using ACT in a non-accepting, compassionate way. That is, you have your depression, anxiety voices, you better accept it, or else, right? So, of course, this is why we spend so much time. That fundamentally is the spirit of ACT, that you yourself would need to be engaged in an accepting manner with your clients too, because we all struggle in this together, that we also have our own frustration with our clients not changing, our own countertransference. And so we can easily apply ACT in a non-acting kind of way. So ACT is also about our relationship with our clients, how we see that our struggle may be different from our clients, but we all struggle in the same way together in this world. So there's a more kind of a we in this. And up to now, I hope that you also see there's probably a close relationship with this with the recovery model, because it fits so well with the recovery model that we are all trying to aspire not really just to control symptoms, but function better. So who may benefit from ACT? I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I'm looking at the time. Who may benefit from this? So I think that right off the bat, people who are struggling with things that hasn't worked with CBT, because CBT worked for a lot of people, DBT worked for a lot of people. So if it doesn't work, then you can obviously consider ACT because it comes from a slightly different paradigm. So people who are chronic, who are refractory, but also people who are substance abusing or personality disorders, who are classically thought to be resistant or complicated, may benefit from ACT. People who like mindfulness may love ACT. But the converse is also true. ACT has also been used for prevention and health promotion. That is to say, regular, normal people and our everyday struggle can very much benefit from ACT training. And it's been shown that it can decrease, let's say, burnout in healthcare providers or nurses' absenteeism. So it has applications for health promotion and just health maintenance. It's evidence-based in that it's been accepted as an evidence-based treatment in the US registry. And you can see then it's been applied to a whole variety of different things in the literature. It's newer kid on the block, so it cannot boast like a ton of empirical research, but it has actually a ton on a wide variety of different areas, as you can see. And there's now some, how about psychosis? Because today is also about psychosis. And I would just kind of briefly touch on it. So mindfulness itself has also been now talked about as perhaps useful for psychosis. Of course, you might have to adapt it. You can't expect people with a lot of psychotic symptoms to do a 40-minute meditation while they're having voices and not having any guidance. So people have written that we need to modify the traditional way of doing, let's say, mindfulness meditation to adapt it for in the case of psychosis so that you're more active, the duration is shorter, and it's more facilitated. And you may be able to also even refer to psychotic experiences in a normalizing way to give it place without giving it special status as one of those experiences that, of course, mindfulness, I haven't defined up to now, but mindfulness, at least in the Western way of seeing things, it is kind of a non-judgmental awareness and attention to the present moment, if I were to kind of define it in a nutshell. So as we're doing this meditation piece, and we adapt it for people with psychotic disorder, which they seem to have some benefit if you do it correctly, which is to say not do it in a very free-floating and regimented, like 40-minute silent retreat kind of thing, but more guided, more active. It can help us achieve that kind of non-judgmental awareness of the present moment, which mindfulness tries to achieve. And this is an article that kind of is, I think is a summary of a lot of the literature up to now. And I just highlight for you that there has been preliminary work look at psychosis using ACT itself. So does it work for ACT? So there are 2 studies that shows that it works for ACT. And in particular, one of them has gotten now a 1-year follow-up reported in 2012. And you can see that people in this case who have been exposed to 4 sessions of 45 minutes ACT before they were discharged from hospital has a lower rate of rehospitalization to people who've never experienced it. And you can see the graph. So this is obviously pilot work. It's on 80 people. So more work needs to replicate, but at least there's an initial optimism that ACT can be one of those things that may potentially be helpful in the context of psychosis. And this is just even more recent. Someone has been looking at even early psychosis, and this may be most relevant than to us here in our discussion today. It's been pointed out that when we try to use whether it's CBT or a psychotherapy for ACT, like ACT for early psychosis, our intention here is not to say that we can replace antipsychotics and that we're not using it to control symptoms, but we are looking at so many other things that has to do with patient functioning. And from this perspective, you can see the ACT techniques can be helpful for coping with positive symptoms like voices, but it can also be perhaps effective at targeting negative symptoms if there's a lot of avoidance. People don't want to engage in things going out. It can be dealing with the loss because after having had a psychotic episode, especially in the context of early psychosis, they may even respond very well to antipsychotics. They have no voices, no symptoms. And yet, we all often, of course, see that functional recovery may not be as optimal. So we can look at ways of dealing with the loss, with challenges of recovery, and also the stigma of having a mental illness. And in fact, I've done a bit of work on using ACT against stigma, because if you think about it, stigma is all about labeling. It's all about what a cat is and about my sense of myself as an ill person. So think about ACT's philosophy of undermining how we label ourselves as I'm a defective or I'm a mentally ill patient, and the potential of this to undermine the stigmatizing process of early psychosis as someone struggling to recover. And of course, the emphasis on values and committed action is all about enhancing functional recovery. So it's not just about coping with symptoms, which is nice to be able to say, let's say, diffuse and let go of the voices. That could be nice. But ultimately, it's also, what do you really care about in your life? And what are the action pieces that can get you there? How do we help you negotiate the barriers and obstacles? And this is the spirit of where ACT comes in. So I hope that you've had like a good kind of introduction. First, about why we need something else in the world, the universe of psychotherapies, and how ACT sees it differently, sees the world differently, and how there could be potential different way of looking at solving problems. Again, not to say that problem solving, cognitive distortions, those things are not important. They are. And what about other cases when it doesn't work? Is there an alternative paradigm? And then now you also have an idea about the 6 core processes of ACT, how they reinforce one another, and how it can potentially be applied to the early psychosis population. So at this point, I will kind of pause for questions and dialogue with you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fung. We have a few questions here. The first question, I'm curious if Dr. Fung could speak about the concern that psychological flexibility may lead to overwhelming self-doubt.
Okay. How does psychological flexibility to self-doubt? I'm trying to even first understand the question, because in fact, we see that a lot of times of self-doubt can come from psychological inflexibility, in the sense that, I guess one of several ways. One is there might be people who are having a lot of self-doubting thoughts, and they become just one more voice, so to speak, in their head, or one more character. That's how they see themselves, as someone who's not confident, so they become wedded to that personality. So psychological flexibility, it's actually freeing ourselves from that. In fact, sometimes we also say, like, oftentimes people come and say that I've been through a lot of psychotherapies and I listened to Dr. Phil, so I know what my problem is. I know I need more self-esteem, so give me more self-esteem. That's the core. So they're looking for something more. And so if you look at the ACT way of looking at things, I mean, there are many different ways of using the ACT model, but one even extreme thing could be, what if it's your fate that you'll continue to have low self-esteem all your life while at the same time achieving every single thing you set out to do? What if you are able to do that? What if you are able to become the Prime Minister of Canada and feel like you don't know what the heck you're doing while you're doing it? Which I'm sure that Stephen Harper is feeling like right now. So, in other words, sometimes when we are after psychological concepts like confidence, self-esteem, they become realistic things, real entities. So I think an ACT perspective is sometimes to even take that apart and say, is it really true? Like for a moment, what if you're the prime minister and you don't know what you're doing, and yet you're doing a good job, or reasonable job, or I'm not trying to make a political statement, but you get my point.
Okay, and here's your next question. Can ACT be delivered in group format?
Yes, ACT can definitely be delivered in group format, because as you can hear, ACT is so flexible, because that's the key word. So some people have applied it as kind of like a one-off, one-session intervention. Some people apply it as a 12-session, 16-session individual therapy, and lots of people do it in groups. I often run it in groups. Right now, I'm running some groups in ACT. And actually, I would say that there are even some benefits from running ACT in groups, because they also learn from one another. I didn't go over in detail, but ACT, as you know, often it's not just convincing, intellectualizing, analyzing. It's also about experience, which is why today, even though it's 1 hour, I squeeze in 2 kind of pseudo-interactive video clips with you guys, because it's experiential. So when you do experiential exercise in a group format, it also can be very powerful, because you can utilize the power of the group. So we sometimes engage it in group exercise together as a group to go through an experience and debrief, and people exchange how they feel in the group and observations. So very much so, we use metaphors, stories, experiential exercises to tap at this way of looking at things, and this different way of shifting. And group is a very powerful format to do that. So yes, absolutely.
And of course, this is a group that loves resources. So is there a book that you can recommend for those who want to use self-help or for health promotion and prevention?
Okay, wonderful. So there are lots and lots of resources now available. Like I think if you go to Caversham in Toronto, if you happen to be in Toronto, I'm sure that there's a whole bookshelf, bookload of books on ACT now. It's become very popular. So one way of getting at all the resources is to Google the ACBS website. It's the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. The reason they call themselves that is, again, the emphasis on philosophy over ACT. So if you Google that, or the short form is ACBS. Okay, I don't know if that helps with memory. ACBS, Contextual Behavioral Science. If you Google it, you'll see a website, and it has a ton of information. You can join. They have what's called values-based dues, if you want to join as a membership, and you can download a lot of resources when you join, which is there's a suggested fee, there's a minimum fee, but it's values-based, and that you can kind of pay somewhere in between. It's all based on your values, how much you care about ACT. So that's kind of the philosophy, so they change it also to how you join. So that's one resources. Off the top of my head, there are lots of self-help books. General health promotion, I mentioned The Happiness Trap. That's very popular. It's written by Russ Harris out of Australia. It's called The Happiness Trap. Another book is called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. And that's another popular self-help book. So they are almost the counterpoint of, let's say, Mind Over Mood and the Happiness Handbook, respectively, in the CBT universe in terms of self-help books. There's also lots of learning resources. There's some self-help books now for particular disorders. I think there's one for anxiety. There's one for social anxiety. So there are lots of other more specific population-based. I don't think there's one written yet for psychosis. So you can be the first.
Just a comment one person has sent in is there's actually an illustrated version of the Happiness Trap that clients have really liked because it's more like a comic book.
Yes.
So that's, again, another resource
Yes.
for people.
They're now starting to do cartoons. I just saw a video animation going around the listserv. So there are multimedia and different things. And Karen mentioned this. In Ontario, we have an Ontario chapter of the ACBS we're forming. And so we're always recruiting. If you're interested, you can always email, join us. and we'll be arranging education opportunities as well.
So some of the practical questions that people have is, where do I get training on ACT if we're interested in that as a program, and suggestions for supervision, what that should look like once you are trained in ACT for EPI teams?
The ACT training, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of resources. People can read, there are now DVD series, people can watch videos. So there are many ways to learn it. Every year, there's a huge ACT conference. This year is in June. If you Google the website, you'll see it's in Minneapolis. Every year, just before the conference, there are pre-conference workshops. That's very intensive, like a 2-day immersive workshops that people can go and learn ACT. They now also sometimes hold periodic what they call ACT boot camps of ACPS that again you can go learn. So that's one way of kind of going to these conferences, workshops. In Toronto, Dr. Surowski and I do some ACT training every year in the fall. So we'll be running an ACT workshop out of the Mindfulness Center. If you Google that, we'll be running a workshop here. As in a chapter, we are organizing various education opportunities. We are bringing in a guest speaker from Australia in September, Louise Hayes. So that's something that's coming around September. So there are various education opportunities, both in terms of self-study, but also workshops and training workshops. And I think that the supervision too, I think is a good question. Because ACT is such a, just the kind of beginning, there is not a whole lot of, let's say, list of supervisors available in Ontario. And that's what we're trying to build towards in the Ontario chapter. We have peer meetings where we have discussions of cases and that once you join, that you can join us, and then there's some kind of peer kind of support going on. And then trying to seek out ACT practitioners who can give supervision. Matthias and I have also been invited for individual agencies to do more intensive training just for them. So we've done that before in the past. So there are various models to look at training.
That's it. Great.
Okay, wonderful. Lovely to be with you all. Thank you.